the art we create is often trying to evoke that sensation where if we can make you fall in love with the living world, like a tree that you've never met and probably you're never going to meet, but still deeply care for them, is, I think, the most important part. And therefore, kind of the greater purpose of how art can be the purveyor of hope, and that can enable us to reframe our relationship, not just for today, but for the generations to come, is really important.
Hey folks, thanks for tuning in to the latest episode of the Ecosystem Member Podcast. I've been really fortunate to have a lot of amazing conversations over these first 16 episodes, and this one might be my new favorite. Ersin on Ersin is an artist and co-creative director of the art collective Marshmallow Laser Feast. I first came across the collective's work through Caroline Till of Franklin and Till when we were on a panel together about the intersection of creativity and nature in 2020. Since then, I've experienced Marshmallow Laser Feast work firsthand at multiple exhibits in London. In this conversation, we talk about Ersin's desire to move from just having a relationship with the more than human world to having a friendship, and how trees can be a portal that connects us to a more ecological understanding of the world. We also discuss how technology like virtual reality and augmented reality can also help us extend our empathy and embody a non-human experience. If you're in the UK, make sure to check out Marshmallow Laser Feast's new exhibit in Manchester, opening in July, called Sweet Dreams, that explores our place in the food chain as humans. I've included a link to more information about this in the show notes, as well as links to many of the artworks Ersin mentions in the episode. Lastly, we're taking a short break in recording new episodes. Make sure to follow us on Substack and YouTube, where we'll be sharing some new stuff in the interim. You can find links to both of these, as well as our Instagram account, at our website, ecosystemmember.com. Without further delay, please enjoy the latest episode of the Ecosystem Member Podcast with Ersin on Ersin of Marshmallow Laser Feast. Today on the Ecosystem Member Podcast, we are excited to talk to Ersin on Ersin, artist and co-creative director of Marshmallow Laser Feast. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
We ask all our guests the same first question as a way to frame the conversation. How do you describe and think about your relationship with nature?
I think trying to reframe my relationship with the natural world as one of friendship. That is, when you can share that core empathy towards the people that you actually enjoy and like and care for, how can I reframe my relationship with the living world in a way that is similar? So trying to find that kind of look at the core fascination that also underpins our work. And most of the work I do stems from, drive to communicate our inseparability to the natural world, but trying to employ some of those things in my day-to-day life in order to speak from a personal way, while also combining with some of the kind of more globally scientifically or spiritual concepts. The most simplest way I think describe is, a line of inquiry that we explore is looking at the living world through the lens of trees as portals, that connects us to the ecological understanding of the world, but also spiritual understanding of the world, and deep time reading through trees. And all of those topics are interesting by themselves, but starting from a place where if I can go and befriend a tree, to spend time with them, trying to read the small cues that they express life in different parts of the year, it just allows me to develop an emotional connection to the way of being that they manifest. And that allows me to internalize some of those things. So every project is somehow, every piece of work we do, somehow trying to deepen that practice, both empirically understanding the natural world, but also emotionally developing a relationship to it.
That is super interesting. So would you say creating this relationship, defining that relationship, especially through this lens of friendship and becoming attuned to, in your example, how a tree is interacting with you in many subtle different ways. Do you think that's sort of the goal of Marshmallow Laser Feast as an art collective? Is there other things you're also trying to accomplish?
We can potentially cluster our line of inquiries on two major camps. One is looking at the world through the lens of kind of a deeper understanding and appreciation and our place within the natural world and how we can relate to that relationship of web of beings. So understanding the world beyond the limits of human senses. And then the other one is looking at the human condition through the lens of more kind of richly diverse narrative-based work. So I can elaborate a little further, getting inspired by the awe and wonder that surrounds us and often not immediately visible or accessible, finding different ways to look at that world, being able to understand the way a tree can manifest themselves, that lives 3,000 years. How can we understand and learn more about the deep time that is beyond human comprehension? Or looking at the interconnectedness through the lens of species place within a small network in a forest, what a mosquito does and how it relates to other species. So being able to disembody a human body and embody something else somehow became one of the main line of inquiries. And then the other part is relating to our societal norms and trying to reframe our relationship with food. It's quite interesting that we consume things like fish fingers, and it's totally normal to have that. And, I'm not dissing that we eat fish fingers, but we are so disconnected from where our vegetables come from, where our fruits come from. So how can we reframe that relationship, not in a finger wagging way, but in a way that it just sparks curiosity and allows us to ask some questions that we often take it for granted. So these two goals, it's safe to say, it's Marshmallow Laser Feast main line of inquiries.
And we had on our previous episode, Mikkel Mikkelsen, who's the head of foraging for MAD, which is Renee Redzepi's nonprofit. And he talks about technology and interfaces and how even grocery stores are interfaces that, to your point, disconnect us from the sources of our food. So when you think about these amazing creations that you bring to life through Marshmallow Laser Feast, I think people often see a dichotomy between sort of the organic and the natural and the technological. Like there is some sort of interface between us. And yet I think, at least from my experience of your work, it brings those things together where it creates something that's even greater than the sum of its parts. How do you think about using technology with nature and the organic? And did you think of other formats as a way to create that feeling and that relationship?
The technology plays an essential role in everything we create because we are born into a realm where creating with computers were very much the norm, and then tapping into some of the emerging technologies, especially immersive technologies like virtual reality or augmented reality, we quite rapidly realized that it would allow us as a tool to see the world through the eyes of something else, or disembody the sense of being human and embody something much stranger, much different than humans. So using technology such as virtual reality to embody sensory perception of different species somehow became one of the line of inquiry where, seeing the forest that you can see with your own eyes and feel with your whole sensory system and immediately shifting it through a virtual reality experience like we did it in the eyes of the animal, where one can embody the sensory perception of a mosquito that sees carbon dioxide, or a dragonfly that sees almost 240 frames per second. This is as fast as your iPhone camera slow motion mode. But our daily sensory perception, obviously, a limit to this. So how can we use these technologies and the experiences we create in the form of experiential art that we can enable someone to see the world through a fresh pair of eyes to create this deeper empathy with the living world. And technology acts like an enabler for us to do that.
And why do you think it's important to sort of bring that relationship, that symbiosis to life? Like, is there a bigger goal beyond just helping people connect?
I'm quite hopeful, even though, most of the climate catastrophes are becoming more and more potent and more real, and sadly the future doesn't look as bright. Yet I'm quite hopeful that we can overcome, when we come together, what human ingenuity is something we celebrate, and it's incredible. So in a world where we can overcome some of the issues that will be occurring very soon, it's a possibility that we solve the issues of anthropocentric human worldview and our relationship with the living world. But what happens after we solve, let's say, this imaginary scenario of this very hopeful outlook where we solved all the problems of the climate change very soon? But we did it in a way that, because we had to, it was our survival was depending on it. I don't think that would take us forward as species and our relationship with the natural world. So even if we get to the brighter side, the other side of the tunnel, in a positive way, still I think there is one missing part where it's not because our life depends on it, it's because we are in love with the living world is more important. So the art we create is often trying to evoke that sensation where if we can make you fall in love with the living world, like a tree that you've never met and probably you're never going to meet, but still deeply care for them, is, I think, the most important part. And therefore, kind of the greater purpose of how art can be the purveyor of hope, and that can enable us to reframe our relationship, not just for today, but for the generations to come, is really important. And it's not like something that we come up with. Obviously, when we look at the indigenous cultures globally, every part of the world, we see this common harmony, the way different indigenous people build their relationship in a very mutualistic, relational way, as opposed to our isolated, individualistic worldview. I think that's going to be the most important part of overcoming the challenges that we will be facing very soon and we are facing today, and then reframing that relationship.
I think that's beautiful. I think there's probably going to be short-term solutions that need to mitigate some of the worst impacts of the climate crisis. But then there is the longer-term view that says we might come up with the technology that helps us out in the next 10 to 20 years, but how do we make sure this doesn't happen again in the next several hundred years? So even though that's a time span beyond the existence of most humans, or at least at this point beyond most humans, it feels like a really noble goal to kind of playing in a way matchmaker with nature of helping people fall in love with these non-human entities.
I couldn't explain any better.
Fantastic. So I think what's also really interesting, especially when I think about art and nature together, we were talking to an environmental neuroscientist who talked about how people gravitate towards landscape paintings. It's because of these fractals in nature, and we just have something innate in us that is attractive to those things. And those are a bit more abstract. Like, it's just sort of representing the beauty. I think what's amazing about what Marshmallow Laser Feast does is that there appears to be a lot of science behind it, a lot of knowledge. What have you learned in creating these experiences and creating this art about nature that maybe you didn't know before? What new ideas have been brought into your life?
I think I can kind of chronologically go through some of the highlights, because one of the pivotal points in our kind of artistic expression goes back to In the Eyes of the Animal. It's a project that we've created in 2015 in Grisdale Forests, which is kind of revolving around the idea of umwelt, meaning the sensory perception of different species and how different that could be. The idea of reality being a singular human-centric thing, completely disassembled and reframed through these ideas that came around 1930s, 40s, and now became more of a norm where we can share the same physical space with other species, and yet the reality that we perceive could be vastly different to theirs. And by understanding that, multitudes of realities that can coexist, it just enriches, but also it creates this deep wonder towards other species' worldview and how interesting and magical that could be. Just taught us so much, but primarily taught us that we know so little. As the studio, as the artist collective, we know so little about the natural world. So learned great deal about Umwelt and sensory perception of different species and how we can tap into some of those ideas. And those kind of inquiries led us to looking at the plant kingdom, which is another magical world open from there. The projects like Tree Hugger, where you follow a single drop of water from the roots of a giant sequoia tree all the way to the canopy, in a virtual reality setting where these trees are, they can live 3,000 years, more than 2,500 years, and they can grow up to 10-story building sizes. The way they manage water all the way up, which is around 1,000 to 1,200 liters a day, is this incredible engineering challenge. And yet, they do that for so long, and so many species in relation to that existence. And how can we embody something so important for our atmospheric connectedness? These trees create clouds, they create rain, they manage the atmosphere basically for themselves and for ourselves. How can we experience this in a way that is not just a piece of text, not a single image, but an internal memory towards embodying something so different than yourself? Or when we kind of fast forward to We Live in an Ocean of Air project, 12 people wearing virtual reality headsets with custom sensors that they can sense, what we can sense their breath, and they embark on a journey to see their own breath as they exhale. A giant tree, another sequoia tree, inhale. So this interconnectedness of humans with the living world, we take anywhere from 17,000 to 30,000 breaths a day. Almost a third to a quarter of those breaths coming from the forests. So we've got this very intimate relationship with the trees, the forests, every day. We are taking the world inside of us, and the world is taking us to inside of them that many times. We've got this very intimate relationship. So how can we highlight these relationalities through the vehicle of something as mundane and as normal as breath? And, when we fast forward Evolver, which we realized in 2021 and launched in 2022, that dives into a human ecosystem following a single breath. This is almost the second piece after We Live in an Ocean of Air, where we can follow a single breath into human lungs. And if you can scale them up large enough, you can see the similarity in its fractal pattern and the manifestation, very much similar to a tree. And experiencing it in such level, and then going into a single cell and seeing that single cell breathes exactly like you do. And then you understand, or at least you come to the question of who breeds who? Is this cell that breeds me? Or is that me that breeds the forest? Or is this the forest that breeds the earth? And that interconnectedness become more tangible. And also we can leave the room with that emotional connection to that interconnectedness. And Sanctuary of the Unseen Forest or the Breathing with the Forest, these are two other projects that we realized over the last 2 years, looking at different species of emergent trees from the tropical rainforests from the Amazon. And these projects are trying to overcome the idea of plant blindness. We have tendency of feeling more emotionally connected to things that exhibit animism. we can easily relate, or at least easier to relate to the feelings of, let's say, non-human animals, easier than plants because they don't exhibit the same livelihood. But what if you were to speed the time up and then take the bark off and see this incredible vibrancy of life that flows through these species? How can we relate to them from that on? So each of these projects allowing us to kind of tap into a different form of symbiosis and making them available as emotional places where it doesn't really matter what happens in these gallery settings where you experience these things. But when you go home or when you go to a park, would you see that livelihood that flows through the tree, the soil? Or would you see that invisible connection that comes out of your nostrils and your mouth into a tree? Can you follow and see that invisible bond? And that's what matters. I think each of these projects are first and foremost teaching us to both scientifically understand some of these concepts, but also emotionally relate and build these almost emotional muscle memories towards relating to the rest of the living world.
And as a human being, you're creating these experiences that more or less decenter the human being. So how do you go about doing that? How do you go about creating experiences as a human that decenter the human in a lot of ways?
So I've got two answers to this actually. One side is this fascinating and very challenging question asked by Thomas Nagel back in the 70s. What is it like to be a bat? It's a philosophical question, and the outcome of that question was we can't know, even if we understand all the inner workings, and we are very far from understanding the cognitive processes both in humans and all the other species, by the way. Even if we understand fully how we perceive reality, how we construct reality within our sensory organs and in our psyche, we can't know unless we are born into those senses and go through that processes. So that's the main challenge. We're never going to know exactly what is it like to be a mosquito. But equally, the second part of it is we've got this ability to expand our sense of self to include an entire family. Or we've got this the ability to expand our sense of body to pilot a huge plane or a tanker going through very, very narrow channels. So if we can extend our sense of self to embody something much larger than ourselves, can we then actually do the same by simply looking at the real fundamentals of what keeps us alive? Extending your sense of self to include a forest. And I think we've got this ability, this fascinating empathy that we can grow. So this idea of being an antidote to the anthropocentric worldview requires us to practice that part. And maybe with the reality of we're never going to fully know, but at least to our best ability to imagine what is it like to be, expanding your sense of self, is definitely going to be the key to overcome our anthropocentric worldview, if it makes sense. And if you take art as the purveyor of hope, or, conveyor of desires, desire for a better world, desire to happiness or fulfillment. So in our work, art becomes a reminder of that hope that lies in the mutuality of the natural world. And without actually extending our sense of self and, suspending our disbelief, we can't really get to that state of post-Anthropocene where the mutualism, the symbiosis among all species valued and cared equally.
That's super fascinating. And sort of bring our conversation to a close. And you talked about this idea of expanding our sense of self. And we talked a little bit about some of your different experiences that you've created, from breathing with a tree to having a vibrating backpack and helping people feel what it's like to be a dragonfly in the food chain. Are there any sort of moments or relationships in nature that you really want to translate into an experience, but maybe you haven't cracked yet, or you're working on, or you're thinking about?
Loads. I think the questions like, what is it like to be a dolphin? Do they dream in sonar? How can we embody that? Or what happens if you were to make the soil invisible, see the nutrients that are flowing, the vibrancy of life that happens underneath, or embodying something like mycelium, a network that can grow to miles? And what is it like to feel, to see with your eye, your eyeballs being on your fingertips and feeling with your entire body? Or, you know, being a whale, a humpback whale or a sperm whale that can communicate across the ocean for thousands of kilometers away. And what is the sense of self for a whale in relation to the ocean? And how can we expand our sense of self to embody or begin to imagine what would that be? And finally, in a more tangible note, we've got a new project launching in July 2024 called Sweet Dreams. It's a new kind of experience that explores human beings' place in the food chain and these big ideas about our desire and appetite through a multisensory narrative experience, which would hopefully reframe in a non-finger wagging and a humorous way our debt to desire and how we can reframe our relationship with the living world and how we consume and how we relate to them. And that is more kind of looking at it in a rich, narrative-driven work. But then the ones that I mentioned, like the Wood Wide Web, embodying mycelium or embodying a whale, is more experiential, non-verbal, more looking at the multisensory experiential part of these things. So these are, and this is just the tip of the iceberg. It's that's why I'm struggling to choose only a few of them. But there are so many incredible stories all around us any given time, and can't wait to just dive into those.
And I can't wait to experience them. Thank you so much for joining us today. I think this has been a super eye-opening, heart-opening experience to hear you share your work here. So thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Rick. Thanks for having me.